Sister Wives Courtroom Shocker, the letter that changed everything. Let's start the second part of the episode. Before you go, if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that bell icon. Let's start. The entire courtroom leaned forward as if pulled by an invisible force, every breath held, every heartbeat pounding in unison. As the tension reached a breaking point that could no longer be contained, and then, in a voice so faint it barely seemed real, Robin finally spoke, her words trembling as they escaped her lips. "There's a letter," and in that single moment the air shattered. Gasps erupting. Across the gallery like a sudden storm, Christine's eyes widening in disbelief as her hands flew to her mouth, Janelle frozen in place as shock overtook her expression, and Meri leaning forward sharply as though refusing to accept what she had just heard. While the attorney stepped closer with urgency, her voice cutting through the chaos, demanding clarity, asking what kind of letter could possibly carry such weight, and Robin broke completely, her composure collapsing as tears streamed down. Her face, her voice cracking under the burden of what she had been hiding as she confessed that it was from one of the children, a desperate plea begging them not to let Kody control them anymore, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. The courtroom descending into chaos as reporters shouted over one another, cameras flashing like lightning strikes, voices rising in disbelief and outrage, while the judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming with authority as he demanded order. But order was no longer possible because this case had just transformed into something far deeper and far more devastating than anyone had anticipated. It was no longer about property or betrayal between adults. It was about the children. About fear, about control, and nothing fractures a family faster than the cry of a child asking to be free. And as the judge continued to bring the courtroom back under control, the weight of what had been revealed settled heavily over every person present. Whispers spreading like wildfire, journalists scrambling to capture every moment, every tear, every reaction, Christine gripping the table as though it were the only thing holding her together, Janelle silently mouthing prayers as her eyes remained locked on Robin. Meri's gaze cutting through the room with an intensity that demanded the full truth, and Robin herself trembling under the pressure, her purse clutched tightly in her lap as though it contained something alive, something dangerous. Something that could no longer remain hidden, her eyes darting toward Kody, whose glare burned with a fury so intense it seemed capable of shattering everything in its path, and when the judge finally demanded an answer, asking directly if she possessed the letter, the moment stretched painfully as Robin's hands shook, slowly reaching into her bag, pulling out the creased and folded paper that had carried this secret for far too long, holding it as if it might burn her, as if the truth inside it was too powerful to be contained, before finally admitting in a broken whisper that yes, she had it, and as it was passed forward, the sound of footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence, the judge carefully unfolding the paper. The faint crinkle filling the room like thunder as his eyes scanned the words, his expression darkening with each line until he finally looked up and began to read aloud, his voice heavy with the weight of the words, revealing a message that cut deeper than any. Accusation, a child's voice pleading for protection, describing fear, control, and threats that no child should ever have to endure, and as those words echoed through the courtroom, the emotional impact was immediate and devastating. Christine collapsing into uncontrollable sobs, Janelle's composure breaking as silent tears streamed down her face, Meri covering her mouth as anger and heartbreak collided within her, and even Robin weeping openly, unable to escape the consequences of her silence. While Kody sat rigid, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and something far more telling, fear, because in that moment the narrative had shifted entirely, and the attorney for the wives rose with a quiet but powerful resolve, declaring that this case was no longer about financial deception but about custody, about protection, about emotional harm inflicted on children who had no voice until now, while the defense immediately pushed back, dismissing the letter as hearsay, as manipulation, as an attempt to weaponize emotion, but the judge's firm ruling silenced the objection, allowing the letter into evidence and opening the door to something even more serious, the possibility of the children themselves being called to testify. A notion that sent a wave of shock through the courtroom, because the idea of children standing before their father to speak such truths was both unimaginable and terrifying, and while Christine pleaded desperately for them to be spared from such an ordeal, Janelle's quiet but firm words acknowledged the painful reality that sometimes truth only comes when it is finally spoken aloud, and as the questioning continued, Robin admitted she had held onto the letter for weeks, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, torn between loyalty and conscience, until she could no longer carry the burden alone, her confession adding another layer to the already overwhelming weight of the case, while the defense attempted to dismantle her credibility, questioning her judgment, her delay, her fear. But before the attack could fully take hold, Christine erupted, her voice cutting through the courtroom with raw emotion as she defended the truth of the letter, pointing directly at Kody and declaring that the fear described within it was real, that their children had lived it, that their pain was not fabricated, and the courtroom once again fell into chaos as emotions reached their peak, forcing the judge to restore order with repeated strikes of his gavel. While Kody finally stood, his composure shattered as he lashed out, denying everything, accusing his wives of manipulation, insisting that he was the victim of a coordinated attack, his voice rising with anger as he attempted to reclaim control of a narrative that was rapidly slipping away. But the damage had already been done, because in that moment everyone in the room saw something undeniable. The mask had cracked, revealing a man consumed not by injustice, but by the fear of losing control. And as the judge ultimately declared that the case would expand to include issues of child welfare and custody, the shift was complete. The trial had entered an entirely new phase, one far more serious, far more personal, and far more devastating than anything that had come before. The following morning, the courthouse stood surrounded by chaos once again, reporters pressing forward with relentless questions about custody, about the children, about what would happen next, while inside the courtroom the atmosphere was even heavier than before. Every person aware that the stakes had risen to an entirely different level, Christine entering first, her exhaustion visible, her face pale from a sleepless night filled with worry for her children, Janelle standing beside her as a steady presence, while Meri followed with a cold determination that refused to break, and when Kody entered with Robin at his side, his posture attempted confidence, but the tension in his movements betrayed him, because he knew what was coming. He knew the fight was no longer about property, but about something far more important, and as the judge called the session to order, his words confirmed it, stating that the court would now consider matters of child welfare and custody, a declaration that sent a ripple through the room as the gravity of the situation fully settled in, and as testimonies resumed, Christine spoke again, this time not just as a wife, but as a mother, her voice filled with desperation as she described her children's fear, their anxiety, their questions about whether they would be taken away, her words painting a picture that was impossible to ignore, while Janelle followed with calm but devastating clarity, outlining patterns of behavior, moments of control, instances that suggested manipulation rather than care, and Meri's testimony added a final layer, describing a dynamic where love felt conditional, where fear had replaced security, and as each of them spoke, the courtroom absorbed their words with growing intensity, while Kody's responses grew more erratic, his anger more visible, his attempts to defend himself overshadowed by the very behavior he denied. Until finally the introduction of professional therapy reports pushed the case even further, documenting the emotional impact on the children in a way that could not be dismissed, and as the judge reviewed the evidence, the final statement of the session left everyone in a state of suspended dread. The possibility that the children themselves might be called to testify now hanging over the courtroom like an approaching storm, leaving every person present with the same unspoken realization. This was far from over, and what came next could change everything forever. The moment Robin whispered those words, There's a letter. The courtroom seemed to collapse inward on itself, as if the very walls could no longer contain the weight of what was about to be revealed, and for a split second there was absolute silence. The kind that doesn't just quiet a room but suffocates it, before everything erupted at once, gasps echoing from every corner, reporters scrambling to their feet, pens flying across notepads, cameras flashing like a storm of lightning, while Christine froze completely, her face draining of color as her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them good, Janelle's lips parting slightly as if trying to speak but unable to form words, and Meri leaning forward with sharp intensity. Her eyes locked onto Robin as though she could pull the truth out of her without another word being spoken, while across the room Kody's entire demeanor shifted, his shoulders stiffening, his jaw tightening, and his eyes narrowing with a warning. That didn't need to be voiced, because whatever that letter contained, he already knew it had the power to destroy everything, and the judge's gavel came down hard, again and again, the sharp crack slicing through the chaos as he demanded order. His voice rising above the noise with unmistakable authority, forcing the room back into a tense, trembling silence, and when he finally turned his attention back to Robin, asking her directly to clarify her statement, the weight of that moment pressed down so heavily it felt almost unbearable, and Robin broke, her composure crumbling as tears spilled down her cheeks, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she clutched her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her voice barely audible as she admitted that the letter wasn't just any letter, it was from one of the children, a desperate plea written in fear, begging not to be controlled, begging to be heard, begging for someone, anyone, to make it stop. And the impact of those words was immediate and devastating. The air sucked out of the room as if everyone present had been hit by this same invisible force, because this wasn't just another piece of evidence. This was something raw, something deeply personal, something that shifted the entire case from a battle over property and betrayal into something far more serious, far more painful, and far more impossible to ignore. And as the judge leaned forward, his expression hardening, he asked the question that no one else dared to speak aloud, whether she had the letter with her, and Robin hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward Kody, whose stare burned with a mix of fury and desperation, a silent command not to go any further. But whatever hold that fear had on her before was gone now, shattered under the weight of truth, and with trembling hands she reached into her bag and pulled it out, a folded, worn piece of paper that suddenly seemed heavier than anything else in that courtroom, as if it carried not just words, but the pain of everything that had been hidden for far too long. And as it was passed forward to the judge, every eye followed its movement, every breath held in anticipation, the faint crinkle of paper echoing unnaturally loud in the silence as he unfolded it, his gaze scanning the contents, his expression shifting in a way that told everyone in that room exactly how serious this was before he began to read. His voice steady but heavy, delivering words that no one could have prepared for, words filled with fear, confusion, and a longing for safety that cut deeper than any accusation ever could, describing a home that no longer felt like a home, a father who no longer felt safe, a life that felt controlled rather than loved. And as each sentence landed, the emotional fallout spread like shockwaves, Christine collapsing into sobs so powerful they seemed to shake her entire body, Janelle lowering her head as silent tears streamed down her face, Meri covering her mouth as her composure cracked under the weight of it all, and even Robin unable to stop crying as the reality of what she had hidden finally played out in front of everyone, while Kody sat frozen, his face flushed, his expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. But beneath it all something else was visible, something he couldn't hide: fear, because in that moment the narrative he had tried to control was no longer his. It belonged to the truth now, and the truth was louder than anything he could say. And when the judge finished reading, the silence that followed was even heavier than before, not empty but filled with the undeniable realization that everything had changed. And as the attorney for the wives slowly stood, her voice calm but firm, She made it clear that this case had crossed into entirely new territory, that this was no longer just about financial deception or property disputes, but about the well-being of children, about emotional harm, about control, and about the urgent need for protection. While the defense immediately objected, their voices sharp as they attempted to dismiss the letter as unreliable, as emotional manipulation, as something that should never be allowed to influence a legal decision. But the judge's ruling came quickly and decisively, allowing the letter into evidence, his reasoning clear that while its origins would be scrutinized, its content could not be ignored, not when it pointed to potential harm. And that decision alone sent another ripple through the courtroom, because it opened the door to something even more serious, the possibility that the children themselves might be called to testify, a thought that visibly shook Christine as she pleaded quietly with her attorney, her voice breaking as she insisted they had already been through enough, that they shouldn't have to relive their pain in a courtroom, while Janelle placed a steadying hand on her arm, her expression torn between protecting her children and knowing that the truth might demand their voices be heard, and Meri remained silent but resolute, her gaze fixed forward as if she had already accepted what might come next, while across the room Kody finally snapped, rising abruptly to his feet as his anger spilled over. His voice loud and defensive as he denied every implication, accusing the women of manipulation, of turning the children against him, of orchestrating a narrative designed to destroy him. But his words no longer carried the authority they once did. Because the more he spoke, the more the cracks in his composure widened, revealing not strength but desperation, and the judge quickly shut him down, reminding him that this was a court of law, not a stage for emotional outbursts, and as he ordered him to sit. The shift in power was unmistakable because for the first time since this trial began, Kody was no longer in control of the room, and everyone knew it, and as the session came to a close, the judge announced that the case would now expand to include matters of child welfare and custody, a declaration that landed with immense weight, signaling that what started as a dispute over assets had transformed into something far more serious, far more personal, and far more life-altering. And as people slowly began to stand, the tension didn't release, it lingered, heavy and suffocating, because no one believed this was the end. If anything, it was only the beginning of something even bigger. The following day, the courthouse was surrounded before sunrise, reporters lining the steps, cameras ready, voices buzzing with speculation about what would happen next, because word of the letter had spread like wildfire, turning an already high-profile case into something even more explosive, and inside the courtroom the atmosphere was even more intense than before, the kind of tension that doesn't just sit in the air but presses down on every person in the room, making it hard to breathe. Christine entering first with visible exhaustion etched into her face, her movements slower, heavier, as if the emotional toll of the previous day had drained everything from her, Janelle walking beside her as a quiet source of strength. Her presence steady, but her eyes revealing the same sleepless night, while Meri followed with a different energy entirely, her expression hardened, her resolve unshaken, as though whatever came next she was ready to face it head-on, and when Kody entered with Robin at his side, the shift was immediate, his posture rigid. His expression guarded, no longer the confident man from earlier proceedings, but someone acutely aware that the ground beneath him had shifted, and Robin, quieter than ever, avoided eye contact completely, her face pale, her movements hesitant, as though the weight of her decision still pressed heavily on her shoulders, and when the judge entered and called the session to order, his tone made it clear that the direction of the case had fundamentally changed, stating plainly that the court would now consider evidence and testimony related to the well-being of the children, a statement that sent a ripple through the room, because it confirmed what everyone feared, that this case was no longer just about the past, it was about the future. About where the children would live, who they would be protected by, and what kind of environment they would grow up in, and as testimonies resumed, Christine took the stand once more, but this time her voice carried something different, not just pain, but urgency, speaking not as someone seeking justice for herself, but as a mother fighting for her children, describing their fear, their anxiety, the way they had begun to withdraw, the way they questioned whether they were safe. Her words painting a picture that was impossible to ignore, while Janelle followed with calm, measured clarity, outlining patterns of behavior that suggested control rather than care, moments that, when viewed together, formed a narrative far more troubling than any single incident could convey, and Meri's testimony added yet another layer, describing a dynamic where affection felt conditional, where approval came with expectations, and where fear slowly replaced trust. And as each woman spoke, the courtroom absorbed their words in heavy silence, the weight of their testimonies building into something undeniable, while Kody's responses grew increasingly strained, his frustration visible, his attempts to defend himself often undercut by his own tone. His own reactions, until even the smallest outbursts seemed to reinforce the very claims he was trying to deny, and when professional reports were introduced, detailing the emotional state of the children, the impact of their environment, and the concerns raised by those who had worked closely with them, the case reached yet another turning point, because now it wasn't just personal testimony, it was documented concern, and as the judge reviewed the reports, his expression gave little away. But the gravity of the situation was unmistakable, and when the session ended with the acknowledgement that further steps might include direct testimony or legal intervention regarding custody, the message was clear: this was far from over. And what came next would not just determine the outcome of a case, but the future of an entire family. By the time the courtroom doors closed on that final day, the atmosphere had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, no longer just tense but suffocating, as if every secret, every accusation, and every painful truth revealed over the course of the trial had settled into the very air, pressing down on everyone inside. And as the judge took his seat, the sharp strike of the gavel echoed louder than ever before, signaling not just the continuation of the proceedings, but the beginning of the end, because everyone in that room could feel it. This was the moment everything would be decided, and Kody sat at the defense table, his composure hanging by a thread, his earlier confidence completely stripped away, replaced by a rigid stillness that felt more like restraint than control, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes fixed forward but unfocused, as if he was already bracing for an outcome he could no longer prevent, while beside him Robin sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze lowered, no longer attempting to defend or explain, as though she had accepted that whatever happened next was beyond her ability to change. And across the room, Christine, Janelle, and Meri sat together, closer than they had been in years. Their unity no longer forced by circumstance, but forged through everything they had endured, their expressions heavy with exhaustion yet steadied by a quiet determination that had carried them this far. And as the judge began to speak, his voice calm but deliberate, recounting the progression of the case, the claims brought forward, the defenses presented, and most importantly, the evidence that had reshaped the entire direction of the trial, it became clear that this was not going to be a simple ruling based solely on legal technicalities, because what had been revealed went far beyond contracts and ownership. It spoke to intent, to behavior, to patterns that could not be ignored. And as he carefully outlined the significance of the testimonies, the financial records, the recorded voicemail, the therapist reports, and most critically the letter from the child, the weight of those combined truths settled heavily over the courtroom, creating a silence so deep it felt almost absolute. And when he finally addressed the issue of custody, the shift was immediate, every person in the room leaning forward, every breath held, because this was no longer about past actions, but about future consequences, and the judge's words carried that weight as he acknowledged the seriousness of placing children in a situation where fear had been expressed, where control had been alleged, and where emotional harm had been supported by both testimony and professional evaluation. And while he emphasized the importance of maintaining relationships between parent and child, he made it equally clear that such relationships must be built on safety, trust, and emotional well-being. not fear or authority imposed without accountability. And as those words settled in, Kody's expression changed, the realization beginning to take hold that the outcome he had been fighting for was slipping further and further out of reach. And when the judge finally delivered his decision, the impact was immediate and irreversible, outlining that temporary custody arrangements would be restructured in favor of the mothers pending further evaluation. That supervised visitation would be considered to ensure the emotional safety of the children, and that a full investigation into the family dynamic would continue, the words landing like a final blow that echoed through the room, and for a moment there was no reaction, no sound, just the weight of what had been decided, before everything seemed to move at once. Christine breaking down into tears as Janelle held her tightly, both of them overwhelmed not with victory, but with the gravity of what it had taken to reach this point. Meri standing beside them, her expression still guarded but her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and sorrow. Because nothing about this felt like a win, it felt like survival, like the aftermath of something that had shattered beyond repair, and across the room Kody remained frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly it seemed as though he might snap it in two. His face flushed with anger, disbelief, and a growing sense of loss that he could no longer mask, and when he finally stood, the movement was abrupt, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he turned toward the judge. His voice rising in protest, in anger, in desperation, insisting that the decision was unjust, that he was being punished unfairly, that everything presented had been twisted against him, but his words carried none of the authority they once had. Because the courtroom had already seen too much, heard too much, and the judge's firm interruption cut him off before he could continue, warning him that any further outbursts would result in immediate consequences, forcing him back into silence. Though the fury in his expression remained, burning just beneath the surface, and as the proceedings officially came to a close, the gavel striking one final time, the sound echoed with a sense of finality that could not be undone. Marking the end of the case, but not the end of its impact, because as people began to file out, reporters rushing forward, voices rising with questions, cameras flashing relentlessly, the real consequences of what had happened were only just beginning to unfold. Christine, Janelle, and Meri moving together through the chaos, shielding themselves as best they could, their focus no longer on the courtroom but on what came next, on protecting their children, on rebuilding something from what had been broken. While behind them Kody stood still for just a moment longer, watching as everything he had once controlled slipped further away, the reality of his situation settling in with a weight that no argument could lift, and Robin remained beside him, quiet, uncertain, caught in the aftermath of choices that could never be undone, and as the courthouse doors finally closed behind them, sealing away the echoes of everything that had been revealed, one truth remained undeniable. This was never just a case about property. It was a story about control, about trust, about the breaking point of a family pushed too far, and in the end, it wasn't the strongest voice that decided the outcome. It was the truth that refused to stay hidden. Thanks for watching this video. Second part is over. Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Next final part of this episode coming very soon.